Okay, we're going to get started now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our deep dive into focused writing. I'm Don Norwood. I'm an editor in the Research Medical Library, and today we're going to talk about ways to make your writing clear, strong, and precise, and also to avoid the pitfalls of wordy, overly complex writing. We're going to start with some things you can do before you start writing, so that you can be adequately prepared to express your research. Next, we'll talk about writing in a linear manner so that your writing flows in a logical way. Specifically, we'll talk about linear writing at the section and paragraph level. Finally, we'll discuss a few things you should do and not do in writing to make sure you describe things in a strong and precise manner. You all know that biomedical writing is complex because of the nature of the subject. Essentially, every topic in this type of writing is a complex one. So writing about these topics has to be somewhat complex. However, you shouldn't compound the complexity by writing in overly complex language. In his important book on nonfiction writing called On Writing Well, the author William Zinsser used an article on transistors published in Scientific American as an example of effective sequential or linear writing, in which the writer leads the reader in logical steps through the subject matter. He said that only through clear, scientific, and technological writing like this can readers make educated choices about areas in which they have little or no education. Precise writing is a product of careful writing. A writer has a duty to carefully give the reader clear, precise information in a way that is as understandable as possible. This is key to focused writing. William Zinsser said that when a reader gets lost, the most common reason is that the writer has not been careful. Therefore, when fulfilling your duty to your readers, you must always ask the following questions when you're writing. What am I trying to say, and have I said it? Would what I wrote be clear to someone reading about this subject for the first time? Asking yourself these questions will help you in allowing your readers to take an escalator, letting them move from point A to point B fairly effortlessly, instead of forcing them to take a staircase, which requires more work to go from point to point. Zinsser also said in his book that writing is thinking on paper. Anyone who thinks clearly can write clearly about anything at all. So what are some concrete ways to think clearly before you write your manuscript? An obvious one is to create an outline. Some of you may have a lot of experience with outlining and have found it to be helpful. Some maybe not so helpful, and some haven't tried it at all. Outlining is effective for many people, but you shouldn't force yourself to do it if it's counterproductive or a time waster. So what else can you try? The University of North Carolina Writing Center suggests brainstorming, which is actually a collection of techniques that you can use to harness the energy of your thoughts about your topic and turn them into clear, focused, written thoughts. One of these techniques is free writing. So this is simply writing down your thoughts as you have them. Don't worry about the grammar or style or punctuation. Just write down what you're thinking. Also, don't edit what you write. That comes later. The second technique is listing words and phrases under a specific topic. Topics can include the overall hypothesis for and results of your study, one or more of your major findings or conclusions, or even something that you didn't observe. Don't be afraid to come up with several lists for one manuscript. It will likely be beneficial in the end. A third brainstorming technique is called three perspectives. This means looking at the subject of your manuscript in 3 different ways to help you think about it clearly. These 3 perspectives are a detailed description of your subject, examining the history of the subject, how it has changed and why, and mapping what the subject is related to, who and what it affects, how others have approached it, and how those other approaches compare with yours. Another great brainstorming technique is asking the 6 journalistic questions that a news story must answer, which are shown here. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. You can answer these questions about the topic of your study and then use the answers to organize your thoughts for translation into your manuscript. These are just a few of the ways you can think clearly so that you can write clearly. If you're thinking clearly about your paper, you'll be able to write it clearly for the target audience. This is true when looking at the big picture of your manuscripts down to examining it sentence by sentence to ensure proper flow in the writing. Most readers have short attention spans. Therefore, maintaining a good flow in your writing is crucial because it will help hold readers' attention. In summary, your readers should be able to walk or run in a straight path instead of a maze. So how do we follow that straight path of clear writing? The answer is to ensure that your writing is linear. Linear writing can be characterized as follows. It's sequential. You proceed through your descriptions with simplicity and logic. It states the hypothesis or the purpose early and with clarity. Linear writing leads the reader in logical steps, sentence by sentence. The evidence presented is narrowly restricted to what's relevant to the topic. A simplified way to look at this is that you proceed from A to B to C to D. In this type of writing, you also link ideas in adjacent paragraphs, such as by using transition words. Also, think of linear writing as escorting your readers through new, difficult territory. Don't assume that your readers know what you think everyone should know, or that they remember what they once learned. Finally, make sure that the conclusion closely relates back to the hypothesis or the purpose statement. In contrast, nonlinear writing is characterized by the following. It is digressive or circular. Circular narratives often end where they begin. And you can see this many times in novels and in movies. It may not have explicit topic sentences and paragraphs, and the thesis statement may first appear in the conclusion or simply be implied. Supporting evidence is not tightly connected in nonlinear writing. Some examples of nonlinear or circular progression include the seasons of the year, solar years, and birth and death cycles. Furthermore, the reader is responsible for understanding the meaning of the text with nonlinear writing. In other words, the mindset is that complex writing must equal strong writing. Nonlinear writing also tends to depart from the main subject of the article. Now, here's another great way to look at these 2 types of writing. First, here's the straight path from A to B in linear writing. Second is the long and winding road from A to B in nonlinear writing. This reminds me of when I lived in Pearland. I could take the linear approach to going to the beach by driving down Highway 288. Or I could take the nonlinear approach and drive nothing but small county roads. So that was a pretty easy decision to make. Here's an example of a linear structure at the paragraph level. This is the introductory paragraph of an article that was recently published in Nature. You can please take a couple minutes and read through that. So you can see in this paragraph, the first sentence states the topic and it provides a little background information. The second sentence adds more information to narrow down the topic. The third sentence describes previous findings that further specify the topic. The fourth sentence states the gap in knowledge, although it does so by using the empty phrase "it is," which is something we're going to talk about later. Writing sentences in a linear sequence like this takes effort, but the effort will be worth it. It will guide your readers along the logical path from point A to point B. You should also seek to write paragraphs in this linear manner. William Zinsser stated that paragraphs should build upon each other, amplifying the ones preceding them. He also described the last sentence of a paragraph as a springboard for the next paragraph, meaning that it'll make the reader want to see what comes next. At the overall manuscript level, this type of linear writing will lead your writers from your research question through the steps you undertook to answer it, to the results you obtained in those steps, to finally what those results mean. We have a handout that includes a link to a video that goes into more detail about linear writing, and we'll be sending that handout to all of you after the presentation. Making sure that your writing is linear is a proven step toward focused writing, or writing that is clear, strong, and exact. Another way to remove the clutter from your is to remove the clutter from your thinking and thus from your writing. Clutter is a problem for many people in different ways. Our minds can be full of clutter, which can result in cluttered writing. The clutter in writing includes a long, difficult phrase that can be replaced with a short one, a vague term that should be replaced with a more exact one, jargon or wordy language specific to the corporate world or government that makes no sense to people outside those areas, which is something that William Zinsser called verbal camouflage. And it includes word clusters that serve no purpose and should be avoided. To ensure that you avoid this type of clutter in your writing, you should make an effort to write concisely and in a clear, strong, and exact way. Being concise does not mean the same thing as being brief. Concise writers make every word count, and the length of what they write is most appropriate for what they're writing about. You can take a few steps to make sure that you write concisely. First, use the subject-verb sentence structure. Avoid unnecessary words. Avoid empty phrases, which we'll define in a little bit. Minimize repetition. Avoid wordy modifiers. Avoid there is and it is and similar phrases at the beginning of sentences. And use active voice instead of passive voice. So we're going to look at each of these steps in a little more detail. First, you need to focus on the subject and the verb in a sentence. You should make these two parts of speech do all the action instead of being the recipients of action. For example, the reason why we performed this study was to should be changed to we performed this study to. The note here about verbs. Seek to use strong, exact action verbs like performed as often as possible. These are much more descriptive than linking verbs like forms of to be, become, and seem. Also, in English, verbs are generally considered stronger words than nouns. William Zinsser calls verbs a writer's most important tools because they push sentences forward and give them momentum. Just like extraneous and unimportant ideas can result in cluttered writing, making it unfocused. Extraneous and unimportant words and phrases can do the same thing. Avoiding these unnecessary words will prevent your writing from being cluttered. Here's an example of a sentence with unnecessary words. Strong formal proof of this hypothesis has not been published at this time. Now here's the revised sentence. Proof of this hypothesis has not been published. The term proof is strong enough to be on its own, making the modifying phrase strong, formal, extraneous. Also, just saying that the proof has not been published is sufficient, as the reader will know that it reflects the current publication status. Now take a minute and read this sentence that's also burdened with unnecessary words. Now read the revised version of the sentence. In this example, the phrase, "it seems to be clear that there is a subset of patients who do benefit," is a very complicated way of saying some patients seem to benefit, which conveys the treatment outcome in a more economical as well as understandable way. Many times, writers include words that aren't necessary in an effort to get their point across. This is quite common in reporting of important results and describing the implications of those results. Therefore, you should be mindful of this when you're writing and avoid using words that aren't needed for the reader to understand you. Even experienced writers fall into the trap of using unnecessary phrases. I'm sure that you've seen many such word groups and articles that you've read and didn't think twice about them. But if you exercise just a little extra care, you can identify these phrases and determine whether they can be replaced or just omitted. Many commonly used phrases can be replaced with a single word. Some other words that you should avoid in your drafts include adverbs that are already expressed in the verbs that they modify. For example, finished completely should just be finished. Completely was already implied with finished. Also, be careful about using other parts of speech that are redundant. These can include adjectives and adjectival phrases as well as prepositions. Now, this redundancy isn't as common as with adverbs, but it can happen. For example, large in size should just be large. So as we've discussed, many phrases in manuscripts are needlessly wordy depending on the context. And here's an example. We sought to investigate should be replaced with we investigated. So for the most part, these phrases are not incorrect or confusing in any way. They just simply have too many words and can be replaced with shorter phrases. Identifying and shortening these phrases is a great skill to have if you're trying to meet a journal's word limit. In addition, forms of the word suggest can introduce wordiness in a few ways, as seen here. Suggests that something may be should be replaced with suggest that something is. The problem with phrases like suggest that something may be is twofold. First, they're just wordy, which is not a terrible problem in the grand scheme of things. But second, and more importantly, they make the author look unsure of the findings, which is more serious. If you double up on the unsure language like this, you make the reader think that you're not very confident in what you observed. Furthermore, you can use short words instead of longer words to make your writing more clear and concise, such as by replacing following with after. That said, you don't want to oversimplify when doing this, as your writing should remain at the level appropriate for your topic in your target journal. Be alert for long words, however, that can easily be replaced with shorter ones. Next, seek to avoid empty phrases. These include phrases like more or less and last but not least. These phrases don't add anything to a sentence, or they can be replaced with a transition word. For instance, all things considered, the patient had a mild case of. This should be replaced with simply the patient had a mild case of. The all things considered is a classic empty phrase. Minimizing repetition in your writing is a relatively easy way to keep out the clutter. Take a look at this repetitive phrase. Children with condition A among pediatric cancer survivors. Pediatric is redundant here, and just simply change it to children with condition A among cancer survivors. Repetitive writing often does little more than adding to the word count. It doesn't often add any information, as you can see in this example. Obviously, a lot of repetition in that sentence. Now compare it with this version with the repetition removed. So you can see in this example that expression can and should be used only once. Be sure to steer clear of wordy modifying phrases that provide additional information about a noun, such as in this example. Diverticulitis, which is a condition that can be very painful. Simplify it to diverticulitis, which can be a very painful condition. Avoid the phrases there is and it is and others like them at the beginning of sentences, as these phrases can greatly weaken sentences. For example, there is a new way to investigate disease A. Restated as a new way to investigate disease A is to. Also, it is impossible for us to say the experiment will work. Restated as we cannot say that the experiment will work. So here's another example of how one of these phrases results in wordiness. There have been several epidemiological studies that have shown a drastic decrease in the mortality of liver cancer in second generation versus first generation Japanese immigrants. Now here's the sentence rewritten without the empty phrase, there have been. Every chance that you get, replace phrases such as there are, it is, there were, and this is with words or phrases that get right to the point. The next example of cluttered writing is use of passive voice in a section of a manuscript that calls for active voice. Here's a sentence from a results type section written in passive voice. Mistakes were made when I created the plan. So you can see that the structure of a sentence written in passive voice is the object of the verb, followed by the verb, and then the subject. This is unclear because the writer leaves open the possibility that someone else made the mistakes. Now, here's the same information in active voice. I made mistakes when I created the plan. The structure of an active voice sentence is the subject, followed by the verb, followed by the object of the verb. Here, the writer leaves no doubt as to who made the mistakes. Another thing you can do to make your writing concise is to combine short sentences. Just make sure that the resulting sentences are not too long and complicated. Also, you should examine your writing for any jargon specific to your field and determine whether it is vague or that someone outside of your field would not understand it. If so, replace it with more understandable terminology. The handout that you'll be getting later has a link to a short video on concise writing. It also has a list of transitional words for linking phrases and sentences. And furthermore, it has a long list of wordy phrases to avoid. Now, these things will all give you additional help on keeping the clutter out of your writing. Okay, I'm going to change course here a little bit and talk some about precise words with an example outside the world of biomedicine, specifically in music. I'm interested in knowing what you think when you hear the word music. Use the chat box and share with us what comes to mind when you think about the term music. I know it's a very general topic. It seems to be getting more general every day. So no thoughts about music at all? Harmony. That's a great one. My father sang harmony in a quartet. I appreciate that very much. Rhythmic. Therapeutic. I second that. Depending on who's making the music. Those are great answers. Okay, now tell us what comes to mind when you think of classical music. I know when I was a child, when I thought of classical music, I thought of Beethoven because of Schroeder on the Peanuts cartoons. Intricate, that's a good one. Sublime and clever. I have to think about those. Can sound discordant. Yes, it can. I tend to avoid that type of classical music. Advance my slides. I didn't want to do that. Music overall and classical music in particular are very wide-ranging and diverse topics. So when I tell someone I've been listening to music lately, that's very broad. Saying I've been listening to classical music is more specific, but I can get even more specific than that. So for example, I may say that I'm listening to a work by Joseph Haydn. That narrows it down, but Haydn composed many different types of music. So I can then say that it's one of Haydn's pieces of chamber music, which is designed to be played in places smaller than a concert hall. If I wanted to get even more specific, I can say that I'm listening to a string quartet piece. Finally, I can just take away all doubt and name the specific string quartet work, such as his string quartet number 62 in C, opus 76, number 3. And that's pretty precise. I also could have mentioned the classical music period for this piece, which was the Romantic period. That's roughly from 1830 to the end of the 19th century. As you can see, precision can have different levels depending on the information that you're trying to convey. Something I hope to leave you with today is the fact that you're not on your own when it comes to learning how to make your writing focused. In addition to seeking our help in editing services and learning from your colleagues and your superiors, you can do things like imitating writers whose work is published in high-impact journals. Researchers whose work has been published in journals like Nature and the New England Journal of Medicine are not only good investigators, but also good writers, or at least they have access to good editors. Therefore, read articles on your area of research published in such journals with an eye for detail regarding both the subject matter and how it's presented on the page. Frequently reading articles in these journals will teach you what a well-written manuscript looks like. This is a concept touted in a recent interview by David Heinemeier Hansen, who's a co-owner and CTO of the software company 37 Signals. He's a computer programmer who created the open source web development platform Ruby on Rails. In that interview with IT visionaries, he advised people to read as much of the best writing in their field as possible. He also advocated for allowing yourself to be inspired by good writers. Look for ways to improve your own writing by reading them. Furthermore, he said that reading may spark enjoyment of writing. Reading good writing can motivate you to get started on a project or resume work on one that you got stuck on. Another thing that you can do to help focus your writing is to read passages that just don't look right out loud. Often you'll see a sentence or phrase that appears to be awkward in some way, but you can't quite put your finger on how or why. A common way to help provide clarity about such passages is to read them to yourself or to someone else out loud. Passages that look a little awkward on the page often sound even more awkward when you hear them. Furthermore, consult references like dictionaries and Roget's thesaurus during your writing. So even the most experienced writers and editors do so daily. And access to them is easier than ever via digital means. That said, be frugal with your use of them. You want consistency in the terminology you use in describing your research, so avoid using these references, especially the thesaurus, to simply find different words to describe the same concept. Another bit of writing wisdom from David Heinemeier Hansen. He said that every investment you make in your writing will pay dividends. If you don't get published, you at least will have grown in your writing ability, which is something that you can build on. Also, he stated that technology changes, but writing is forever. The things you use and do in the lab or the clinic will likely change, maybe frequently, but the need to communicate about your research and to do so clearly will remain constant. Now, although we've covered a lot regarding focused writing, we've really just looked at the tip of the iceberg today. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box and I'll do my best to answer them, or at least direct them to someone who can. And also my colleague, John, has posted a survey about today's session in the chat box. One more minute here. Okay, our question: What are mistakes you see made most often in journal articles you have edited or read? Oh, that might take a lot longer time than we have allotted today. I would say the one I see most often is that the writer writes in a way that assumes that the reader knows as much as he or she does. They usually will write in a way as if they're talking to someone else in the lab or the clinic who's basically elbow deep in whatever they're working on. And they don't assume that their reader doesn't know what they're working on, is not that involved in it. And they need more information than what has been provided. So there are many ways that they can manifest, but the most obvious way that I see that is if they're assuming information instead of actually stating it. So like we said earlier, you can't assume that your reader knows as much as you do. Don't never take that for granted. I mean, you don't have to explain. You don't have to say that cancer is a deadly disease. You don't have to go that simple. But you have to remember that people reading the journal that you're published in are not all specialists in what you are. That's a good question. It's that's one I would want to know. Well, let's see, we don't have any other questions. To recap, if you want your writing to be focused, make sure, let me see if this will advance for me. You make sure that you think about your research clearly so that you can write about it clearly. Use the linear approach in writing about your research. Make every effort to keep clutter out of your mind and out of your writing. And removal of that clutter will result in clear, strong, and exact writing. Now, following these guidelines will help you bring your message into focus so that you can express yourself as effectively as possible. Okay, I have another question. Within a section, are more or less paragraphs preferred? I would say more. Short paragraphs are very easy to read. Long paragraphs are very intimidating. If you look at a printed page, especially in a journal, well, both actually online as well, and you see a large block of sentences with no white space in between, it's very off-putting. And when you get to the end of the paragraph, sometimes you can forget how it started. And that's something that we talked, that William Zinsser mentioned, is that you want the paragraphs to have a logical flow and to kind of springboard from one to the next paragraph. So shorter paragraphs, not one sentence paragraphs, obviously, but short enough to accurately describe each point, and then have a logical stopping point to where you can start the next paragraph. How many revisions are usually needed before submitting the paragraph? I mean, before the manuscript. In other words, when to know is it okay to stop revising? That's a difficult question for editors to answer, because sometimes we wonder when it was okay to stop editing. I would consult a supervisor, a PI, someone who is experienced in publishing and has written has a lot of manuscripts published, because it's difficult. Some people, they can write out the very first draft is ready to go, and some it takes 10. It varies widely. Consulting someone who has been published consistently, that's the best advice I would give. Well, we greatly appreciate your attendance for this session of Deep Dives. I know you have tons of things that you could be doing today, and I greatly appreciate you taking your time out to join us. Also, thank you for any other sessions that you've participated in. Just remember that we'll have one more deep dive session entitled How to Shorten an Abstract, and that's going to be at 1 o'clock on Thursday, June the 22nd. Okay. Please go to our website at the URL seen here for more information about our services, recordings of the webinars we've conducted, and information on our classes, which you can register for at the site at the bottom of the slide. And if you have any other questions or need further assistance, you can always reach us by email or phone. Thanks again for joining us today. Give one last check to the chat box. I hope that the information that discussed proves to be helpful in your publishing pursuits. So have a great day and happy writing.